We want to welcome everyone to our Crip pandemic Instagram lives. I'm Corbin Outlaw. I've been working as a graduate assistant on this project, and I'm so excited to be here with everyone today. This is the first of a series of conversations between the contributors for both issues of Crip Pandemic Life, A Tapestry. I want to welcome Jessie Male and Hailee Yoshizaki-Gibbons to the conversation. Because this is a pretty short conversation, I think we're just going to get right into it. I prepared some questions, so we're going to start there. Our kind of goal for both the conversation and those watching is to be a casual, fun, and emergent conversation. So I encourage you both to take the conversation where you want to, and also for folks watching to send us questions. To start though, could you both give a 2-sentence overview of your piece? And Jessie, if you want to start because you're on my left.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Corbin, for hosting this. Just really happy to be here. And so thinking about how to most effectively kind of summarize the piece, how do you grieve during an apocalypse? Well, the first is that this piece was sort of my very personal answer to that question. It was a way to help me figure out how to grieve this tremendous loss that occurred during a time of tremendous global loss, right? Loss upon loss upon loss. But more specifically, it was a space for me to really ruminate, and I resist the language of elegy on my Aunt Joyce's, very complex life, and on my relationship to her and her life. And we're going to get, I'm sure, more into this later, but, to also provide documentation of an individual who throughout much of her existence was seen as less valuable because of her disability and because of many of the choices that she made on how to live as a disabled woman in the world.
Yeah, thank you. It is an incredibly powerful piece, and I'm excited to get into it. Hailee, if you want to give us an overview of your piece.
So I just want to start by saying these overview questions always give me enormous anxiety. And I always try to prep, and then I'm like, no, I'm just going to speak from the heart. It's going to be fine. But my piece on Mia Mingus's call to leave evidence, and very similar to Jessie's piece, which I'm really excited to be in conversation with. It's about grieving and how grieving is happening for many of us, in multiple layers, during the pandemic. Especially the height of it, where for me, the grieving process really started for one particular person that I focus on, Sylvia, which is a pseudonym. And I really think about how her life as a woman with dementia in a nursing home reflected what was happening with the pandemic in terms of the government and our society deciding who is valuable and who is not, and who is worth saving and who is not. And so for me, the call to leave evidence was really about making sure that we don't forget about all the people in nursing homes who died. We don't forget about the people with dementia who, likely died alone, many of them without any access to family. Sometimes care workers weren't even in the room. And so I think that both of our pieces really highlight grief, which is something as a culture we turn away from. And so something I appreciate about Jessie's piece, and I think my piece also reflects, is this idea of actually turning towards grief and embracing grief as part of Crip life.
Yeah, that's so well put. And overviews are anxiety inducing. So talk about your pieces the way you want. But yeah, I Hailee, you kind of started to get into what you kind of see in each other's work and how you think readers or how you want readers to respond, reading these together, and kind of it's Crip like a tapestry. So we like to think of the way that things interweave, and also sort of this like texture of all of this, and sort of bringing those together. So yeah, if you would like to speak on each other's pieces and what, you sort of highlighted, and what struck you the most about them. Sorry, I just asked 4 questions.
Yeah.
Let me just walk that back a little. What do you want readers to get out of reading your work together, or what do you kind of see there?
Well, I think Hailee, I think a lot of what Hailee just said, I think touches upon some of the really central ways that our works are in conversation. I think reading a lot of the pieces actually within the special issue is so many of us reference Mia Mingus's work and that call to leave evidence. And I think, the idea of leaving evidence of disabled lives, this is something that is not new to pandemic times. But I think we're so quickly, as Hailee pointed out, we're experiencing a cultural resistance to recognizing the tremendous grief and loss that was and continues to be experienced due to COVID, right? Like COVID is still in existence, and yet there is this cultural imperative towards the return to normal, right? And how do we resist that? It's through stories, and it's through reminders and calls to action. And obviously, I don't want to speak for like Hailee and what your work, is what's imbued in your work, but I think implicit in everything I do, and including this piece, is there's a call to action to say, like, we're not going to forget, right? And the stories of women like Joyce and like Sylvia, who, for Joyce specifically, right, her death was probably COVID, possibly not. But the narrative of her life is not the stories that many people want to hear about a disabled woman, right? Including the end of it. And it's important to document that. And to resist a continuation of the experiences of what is happening in nursing homes, right? That these are spaces of isolation, and that are often, there is so much loss of autonomy that happens in these spaces. But I think that both my work and Hailee's work, right, in some ways resist this idea that there is no autonomy in these spaces. Yeah.
That was great, Hailee. I want to give you a chance to respond. But I think it would be, as we move forward, I would love to hear more from you both about this idea of grief and the cultural resistance to that, but also the embracing of it by this form of evidence, especially as, the material reality of all of this is sometimes the only way I can think to say it, and how things are being walked back. But Hailee, of course, I want to give you a chance to respond.
Yeah, I just want to build on what Jessie was saying. Something that really struck me about her piece is and I think I did this as well, like this focus on like the language of grief and death, right? Like, so I talk about how, for example, people with dementia are already viewed as dead, right? They're already seen as gone, quote unquote. And so their deaths were very much disregarded, even though they were happening in mass. And Jessie, you also talked about this idea of like saying things like, oh, she's no longer suffering, right? And that's like the language of grief that we use to comfort ourselves. But I really loved how you talked about, like, how do we actually complicate that idea, right? Like, how do we resist this idea of, I think you said something like transitioning from suffering to normalcy. And also thinking about how, I mean, to talk a little bit about one of the editors, Ali Pet-Savis's work, right? Like how these things are leaky, right? Like suffering and grief leak onto others from us. It's not like a singular, this person's no longer suffering and now everything is normal and fine, right? But that's kind of like a myth that we want to tell ourselves. So I think that was something that really struck me about our pieces in conversation, is that focus on like the language of death, the language of grief. And I really appreciated like Jessie's really focus on, I think it was your cousin, right? And how she was, or I don't know I'm sorry, I don't know their pronouns, but they were using this like rhetoric to comfort themselves. And I think that a lot of people used similar rhetoric to dismiss all the deaths that were happening in nursing homes, right? Like, oh, those people were already sick. They were old. Oh, they had long, meaningful lives, which, you know, we don't actually know who did and didn't consider their life long and meaningful, but right, that's the kind of like rhetoric we were using to dismiss the deaths of old and disabled people in nursing homes, but also outside of nursing homes. And I think that's something really important to look at, is to really like do a close reading of that discourse.
Absolutely. Thank you for your response. I do just want to point out that people are throwing up hearts in the Instagram chat and appreciate the discussion. So just want to convey that. I can go ahead and throw another question at you both. I mean, we've kind of answered a bunch of my questions, but yeah, I love the way that language is used, and that sort of kind of push and pull between like, again, like the resistance, the embrace. I'm trying to think of a question. There's just so much, and I want to give you both the opportunity to talk. Yeah, would you, I'm happy to ask a question, but if you have comments to make, sorry, I'm a little nervous.
No, oh, sorry. No, you, Hailee.
You brainstorm if you'd like.
I want to, you know, something I really appreciate about Hailee's work, and honestly, before, you know, we gathered on the Instagram Live, I was telling Hailee, I remember seeing your work years ago, right? And still in many spaces within the field of disability studies, right? As well as other cultural spaces, there's still so much tension between like the relationship between like aging and disability. And so to bring these conversations together and to talk about elder care and the significance of that, both as in relationship to disability and also in distinct ways, but more specifically about how Hailee's work addresses language, and how much I appreciate this resistance to the idea of like the linear, coherent narrative as the only narrative of value and the only indication of being able to effectively communicate, right? This idea, the kind of dismissiveness that many of the doctors or the caretakers have towards Sylvia because she's not speaking quote unquote coherently, right? And instead thinking about this restructuring of language as a space of possibility and as a space of joy, right? Like what again, going back to like some of the ways that our works really intersect, is really important to me to describe the joy and the full-bodied nature of my Aunt Joyce's existence, right? And Hailee, when describing Sylvia, does so in similar ways. And so, as Hailee mentioned earlier, the way that language is oftentimes associated with being the only valuable form of communication, right, is through coherent verbal language, right? And to demonstrate a resistance to that, that there are small moments, the touching of hands, right? The flipping through the pages of a notebook, that are indicators of care between people. And to, again, to return to the idea of documenting the small moments.
Yeah, I have one of the things that struck me the most about both of your work and is coming to mind now is the narrative itself, sort of following that kind of nonlinear structure and intersecting messily with everything else going on. And that sort of that joy, absolutely, that embracing of grief at the same time as embracing joy, kind of coming together. And I think I wanted to ask if you would both want to reflect on, Crip time and how that sort of, there was the grief time, and Hailee, I believe you, and I'm so sorry if I got this wrong, but you wrote about dementia time, which was very new to me. And so, as we wrap this up, I would I'm kind of posing that question of if you both want to, prompt to reflect on time and narratives and grief. And if anyone watching wants to send in a question, we have about 2 minutes left before we have to wrap up. But yeah, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you.
I think that something I appreciate about our pieces in conversation is that, like Jessie said, they're not like what we would consider coherent linear narratives, right? Like we both kind of play with time by going back and forth. And then there also is, right, this idea of Crip time, the flexibility of time, right? Thinking about time in different ways that meet the needs of different body minds. And I think that's, even though we don't go into great detail about that, it's reflected actually in the way that we kind of structure our pieces. And also like to how grief works, right? Like grief isn't linear, as we often say, but right, sometimes it can be hard to like accept that. But by reflecting like the cyclical nature of grief in both of our pieces, I think we're highlighting, right, like how time, how memory, right, can be warped and changed and can turn into different things, and how that's okay. And how can we learn to accept that, right? Something that is important in dementia time is just focusing on the moment, right? And appreciating whatever meaning is there in that moment, rather than demanding, right, this linear, coherent, rational narrative. And I also just want to say another way I think that, at least for me, like even writing this piece played a lot with time for me. And I think, Jessie, you said something very similar in the beginning when we were talking, but in 2018, I lost my aunt and my dad within 6 months of each other from colon cancer. And then when the pandemic hit, and I found out that Sylvia had also died, a lot of like grief from my family also resurfaced. And I actually cried reading Jessie's piece because it made me think of my own aunt in a lot of ways. And I just love that you memorialized like your relationship with her, but also talked about like the hard things. And I think that's kind of what's difficult when we think about grieving with the pandemic is, right, like, well, one, we always wish like, oh, I wish I would have been there more. I wish I would have seen her. Like I went through the same thing with Sylvia. I kept thinking like, why didn't I go to the nursing home right before this hit? Why didn't I do this? Why didn't I do that? And it's actually one of the reasons, and I mentioned this, like I recorded my goodbye to Sylvia because I'm starting to forget what my dad's voice sounded like. Sorry. And I wanted to like memorialize our love and care for one another. And I feel like, Jessie, you really did that in your piece with your Aunt Joyce.
Yeah. Yes, like so much of what you're saying, I think the idea, right, that the relationship between Crip time and grief time, like, you quote Ellen Samuels, that's, Crip time is either as or is grief time. But I think for me, I've been thinking a lot through reading your work and reflecting on my work of grief time as Crip time, and that my familiarity, my own experiences with Crip time, watching Joyce and my mother and other disabled people I love operate in Crip time, that has helped me navigate grief time. And this idea that, there isn't an endpoint to grief, which on the one hand, I think can be really terrifying, right? Like we want the pain associated with grief to end, to have a stop point. But also that's what's also incredibly beautiful and powerful about grief, is that there are the smallest moments where the memory of someone can resurface. And so for me, I think writing this piece was really helpful because I had a lot of regret about the moments that I wasn't there, right? What I couldn't know were the last times. But it also allowed me to access those small moments and to remember the feel of like her hand against mine, to remember like the sound of her voice, or, the small intimate moments that made her so significant to me, right? And that's, again, like when thinking about the work and how you write about your relationship with Sylvia, right? At the end of the day, I think oftentimes a life is valued through the scale of its significance towards others, right? Which is also why I love memoir versus autobiography, because autobiography is oftentimes like, look at the large scale impact, right? And it's like one person can have impact on one person, and that is significant. That's important. And I think that's what's documented here. And for all of us to remember as we reflect on how we've experienced losses due to COVID and beyond, is like every moment holds its individual significance, and that's powerful. Yeah.
Lots of hearts from Instagram. Yeah, it was such a privilege to get to read both of your work. And yeah, I definitely cried a lot. And so I wanted to thank you both. So we're kind of wrapping the conversation up. If there's anything else you'd like to talk about, I want to go ahead and thank the captioner. This work would not be possible for us to share without their hard work, as well as thanking the DCC for the support and for hosting this. And of course, more than anything, thank both of you for writing these pieces, for sharing them, and for coming to talk about them today.
Yes, just to echo, thank everyone for the space to be in conversation. And for those of you who've tuned in through Instagram, and I'm excited for the upcoming conversations also. So
yes, as we wrap up, oh sorry Hailee, I was just gonna invite people to ask any questions they might have before we end, but yeah, please, sorry.
Oh, yeah, that's fine. I actually just asked in the chat, like, do we have any questions? Because I just want to make sure we gave time and attention to those. But I just want to echo what Jessie said, that I'm very honored to have been invited to participate in this conversation, to be in conversation with Jessie, and to reflect on our work together. I think our pieces had so much overlap and so many interesting areas for further exploration. So it was just a privilege and an honor to have this experience.
Yeah, and yes, next week we'll be talking to Kim Fernandez and Carolyn. Should have looked up how to pronounce this name. Carolyn Hay. So we're going to be talking about spaces and sort of their pieces in, or space and spaces regarding their pieces in Crip-pandemic life. So looking forward to doing this again. And if you have time to tune in, we'd really appreciate to have people here. Yeah, I just want to thank everyone. This has been a really wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.